The Battle of the Somme, fought from July 1st to November 18, 1916, was one of the most significant and devastating battles of World War I. Taking place along the Somme River in northern France, this Anglo-French offensive against German forces resulted in over 1 million casualties, making it one of the bloodiest battles in history. The Battle of the Somme is remembered for its extraordinary loss of life, the limited territorial gains it achieved, and the brutal realities of trench warfare. Despite its catastrophic human toll, the battle had far-reaching effects on the course of the war, the military strategies of the future, and the national psyches of the combatant nations. By 1916, the war on the Western Front had settled into a stalemate, with neither side able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Central Powers, led by Germany, were locked in a deadly and static trench warfare against the Allies, which included France, Britain, and their empires. The trench lines stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, with both sides deeply entrenched, making movement and strategic victories difficult. The Battle of the Somme was planned as a joint Franco-British offensive, primarily to relieve pressure on the French forces, who were engaged in the Battle of Verdun. Verdun had become a symbol of French national endurance, and the French army was stretched to the limit defending it. To aid their allies, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, under General Sir Douglas Haig, took the lead in launching an offensive on the Somme, a region chosen because of its weak German defenses and because it was where British and French armies met. The Allies also hoped the Somme offensive would break through German lines, deliver a decisive blow, and led to the collapse of the German war effort. The British, in particular, were eager to prove their growing military strength, as 1916 marked the first time Britain had fielded a largely conscripted army, having expanded its forces significantly from its pre-war professional army. The Germans, for their part, were well entrenched and had constructed a formidable defensive system of deep trenches, barbed wire, and fortified positions. They were aware of the Allied plans for an offensive but were primarily focused on Verdun, where they believed the battle for the war would be won or lost. The Battle of the Somme involved over 3 million men from various nationalities. On the Allied side, the British Expeditionary Force consisted of around 1.2 million men, including soldiers from Britain, Ireland, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. French forces, commanded by General Ferdinand Foch, also participated with around 400,000 troops. Opposing them were the German forces, numbering around 500,000 men at the start of the battle. The British Army was under the overall command of General Haig, who believed that a prolonged artillery bombardment could destroy the German defenses and allow British infantry to advance with minimal resistance. For 7 days before the attack, from June 24 to July 1, 1916, the British and French forces bombarded the German lines with over 1.7 million shells, in what was then the heaviest artillery barrage in history. The expectation was that this bombardment would destroy German barbed wire, obliterate trenches, and kill or demoralize the defenders. The offensive began on July 1, 1916, and is remembered as the worst day in British military history. At 7:30 a.m., tens of thousands of British soldiers went over the top, climbing out of their trenches to advance across no man's land towards the German lines. However, the artillery barrage had not achieved its intended effect. Many of the shells had failed to destroy the German defenses, and large sections of barbed wire remained intact. Moreover, the Germans, anticipating the attack, had sheltered in deep bunkers and emerged as soon as the bombardment ceased, manning machine guns and artillery. The result was a massacre. The British soldiers, advancing in rigid lines as part of a doctrine of massed infantry attacks, were cut down by machine gun fire. The British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, including 19,240 dead, making July 1 the single bloodiest day in British military history. Despite this, Haig ordered the offensive to continue, believing that persistence could still achieve a breakthrough. The British Army faced several unique challenges during the battle. Many of the soldiers involved in the initial assaults were volunteers from Kitchener's army, formed at the beginning of the war. These troops, often referred to as PALS battalions, because they enlisted and fought alongside friends from their hometowns, were brave but inexperienced. The lack of proper training and the rigid tactics they employed made them vulnerable to the German defenses. Additionally, poor communication and coordination between artillery and infantry meant that artillery bombardments often missed their targets or inadvertently endangered advancing troops. For the Germans, the challenge was one of endurance. Although their defensive positions were formidable, the Somme was primarily an attritional battle, and the relentless Allied attacks forced them to commit more and more resources to hold their lines. German troops had to contend with constant artillery bombardments, the ever-present threat of infantry assaults, and deteriorating conditions in the trenches. Despite being on the defensive, German forces showed remarkable resilience and tactical adaptability throughout the battle. The French, though engaged primarily at Verdun, contributed significantly to the Somme offensive. French troops were experienced and battle-hardened after 2 years of warfare, and they had learned to adopt more flexible, decentralized tactics. However, the scale of the losses at Verdun meant that they could not fully commit as many resources to the Somme as originally planned, placing much of the burden on the British. The Battle of the Somme was notable for its introduction of new military technologies that would come to define modern warfare. One of the most significant was the first use of the tank. On September 15, 1916, during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, a phase of the Somme offensive, the British deployed tanks for the first time in combat. These early tanks were slow, mechanically unreliable, and vulnerable to artillery, but their psychological impact was immense. Although they did not achieve a breakthrough, the tank's appearance on the battlefield foreshadowed its future importance in mechanized warfare. The Somme also saw extensive use of air power. Reconnaissance aircraft played a crucial role in spotting artillery targets and observing troop movements. The skies above the Somme became a battleground in their own right, as German and Allied pilots engaged in aerial combat in what became known as dogfights. The battle demonstrated the growing importance of controlling the air, a factor that would become increasingly critical in later conflicts. After 4.5 months of fighting, the Battle of the Somme ended in mid-November, with the onset of winter and the exhaustion of both sides. The Allied forces had advanced only about 6 miles into German-held territory, capturing a few strategic points but failing to achieve the decisive breakthrough that Haig had hoped for. The Germans, though forced to give ground, had managed to hold on to most of their positions and remained a potent fighting force. The human cost of the battle was staggering. The British sustained around 420,000 casualties, including 125,000 dead. The French suffered approximately 200,000 casualties, while the Germans lost an estimated 465,000 men. Despite the horrendous loss of life, the battle was inconclusive, with no clear victor. However, the Somme did weaken the German army, depleting its reserves of men and material, and forcing the Germans to adopt more defensive tactics in the later stages of the war. The Battle of the Somme had profound and lasting effects on the conduct of World War I and military strategy in general. It underscored the futility of frontal assaults in the face of well-entrenched machine gun defenses and demonstrated the horrors of attrition warfare, where gains were measured not in miles but in bodies. The battle became a symbol of the senseless slaughter and the stalemate that characterized much of World War I. For Britain, the Somme marked the beginning of the end of its reliance on mass infantry assaults and signaled a shift toward more coordinated, combined arms tactics involving infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. It also marked the emergence of the British Army as a major force on the Western Front, as it expanded and learned from the costly lessons of 1916. In terms of national memory, the Somme became deeply embedded in the consciousness of Britain, France, and Germany. In Britain, the loss of so many men, particularly from the volunteer battalions, had a profound impact on communities, as entire towns were bereft of their young men. The Somme, like Verdun for the French, became a symbol of sacrifice and suffering. The Battle of the Somme was a turning point in World War I, though not in the sense of a decisive victory. It revealed the brutal realities of modern industrial warfare, where technology and numbers could grind down even the most resilient armies. Despite its horrific cost, the battle played a critical role in wearing down the German army, setting the stage for the eventual Allied victory in 1918. The Somme remains one of the most poignant and tragic episodes of the Great War, a testament to both the bravery and the futility that characterized much of the conflict.